In October of 1968, Jacqueline Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis, and the world reported it as one of the most astonishing marriages of the century. Published accounts later added a complication the headlines had no room for. Onassis had been romantically linked to Jackie's younger sister, Lee Radziwill. Lee was beautiful, had 2 children and a royal title, and sat close to the center of international society. And once again, the name printed next to hers was Jackie's. The easy version of this story says one sister took a man from the other. That version is simple to remember, and it skips the part that actually shaped Lee's life. What happens to a woman's sense of herself when everything she tries gets measured against the most famous woman in America? Welcome back to Gilded Women, where we look beyond the perfect image to the woman history left behind. This is not an attempt to prove that Jackie stole Aristotle Onassis. The surviving record will not carry an accusation that simple. It is the story of how Lee Radziwill collected nearly every symbol of an independent life and was still introduced, even in her obituary, as Jackie Kennedy's younger sister. Before the First Lady, the Princess, the shipping magnate, and the Kennedy legend, there were 2 Bouvier girls in a family that paid close attention to how things looked. Jacqueline Bouvier was born in 1929. Caroline Lee Bouvier arrived in 1933, 3.5 years behind her. There was money in the family, along with distinguished connections, an apartment in Manhattan, and summers in East Hampton. From outside, it all looked permanent. Inside, it was much less secure. Their father, John Vernou Bouvier III, was known as Black Jack. His daughters adored him. He was charming and handsome, and he was also a heavy drinker who was unfaithful to his wife and unreliable with money. His marriage to Janet Lee Bouvier fell apart while the girls were still young. The divorce cracked the polished surface of their childhood, though it never touched the rule that came with that childhood. Whatever happened at home, the sisters were expected to look composed in public. Biographies of the family tend to describe a childhood organized around comparison. Jackie was older, did well at school, and was already being noticed for her writing and her writing. Lee was quicker socially, livelier, and set on not being treated as the lesser child. Those differences are easy to stretch into a feud that started in the nursery, which is tidier than anything that happens between actual sisters. Sisters compete and stay close. They can resent the comparison and still love the person on the other end of it. Lee and Jackie spent decades demonstrating how uncomfortable that can get when the audience is an entire country. Neither of them began as an accessory to the other, and that matters to everything that follows. Both were raised to believe that looks, manners, intelligence, and the right husband would open the important doors. Both also learned that approval had conditions attached. Their parents' world rewarded a daughter who stood out, but it almost never let 2 daughters stand in the same place without ruling on which one had done it better. In 1951, when Lee was 18 and Jackie 22, the sisters traveled through Europe together. They crossed the Atlantic on the Queen Elizabeth and kept a record of the trip in drawings, photographs, and handwritten notes. Years later, that private family scrapbook was published as One Special Summer. It caught the 2 of them before their adult names had settled over them. Curious, mischievous, watchful, and able to enjoy each other's company without a nation keeping score. The book also undercuts the rivalry story in a way most accounts skip past. Jackie contributed drawings, poems, and sections on several cities. Lee wrote up many of their adventures. They were collaborators. That does not prove jealousy never existed, but it does mean the relationship cannot be filed under envy and left there. Before one of them was First Lady and the other was a princess, both had already learned that affection and comparison can live inside the same family. Lee did not spend her early adulthood waiting for Jackie's life to start. She had a brief run in fashion, working in a world shaped by the editor Diana Vreeland, which put her close to taste, magazines, clothes, and the people who decided what American women were supposed to admire. She had an instinct for presentation that stayed with her long after other ambitions had collapsed. At that age, though, a career was not what young women of her class were expected to organize their lives around. Marriage was. In 1953, at 20, Lee married Michael Canfield, a publishing executive. They lived in England, where Lee entered a social world different from New York and just as conscious of lineage and rank. The marriage did not last. Accounts of the breakup point to Canfield's drinking and to Lee's growing attachment to Stanisław Albrecht Radziwill, a Polish-born aristocrat everyone called Stas. What can be said without dispute is that the first marriage ended and the second one put a title in front of her name. Lee married Stas in 1959. The press called her Princess Lee Radziwill, and the society pages knew exactly what to do with that. Stas came from one of Europe's most prominent aristocratic families, though the title carried social prestige rather than any governing power. Lee now had a husband with an old name, houses in fashionable places, and a way into an international circle of money and influence. She and Stas had 2 children, Anthony and Anna Christina, called Tina. Lee later talked about parts of those years with real tenderness. There were the houses in England, the travel, the children, and a social life that put her among politicians, artists, aristocrats, and businessmen. None of that was imaginary. Lee had access. Almost nobody reading about her would ever get. It would also be wrong to cast her as a passive young woman being carried from one grand room to the next. Lee wanted a larger life. She liked position, beauty, interesting company, and being recognized. She did not simply put up with the attention that came with being a Bouvier and a princess. At times, she went looking for it. That ambition makes her harder to summarize and more recognizably human. What she wanted was the freedom of an exceptional life without being permanently defined by the relationships that had made the life possible. For a short stretch, the title looked like it had solved the problems set up in childhood. Jackie had married Senator John F. Kennedy in 1953. Lee had married a man the newspapers called a prince. Each sister seemed to have her own public world. Then Kennedy won the presidency in 1960, and no European form of address available to Lee could hold up against what happened next. Jackie did not just become the wife of an American president. She became an international image. The clothes, the voice, the White House restoration, the languages she spoke, the travel, and the small children added up to something far bigger than political celebrity. Magazines and television carried her into American living rooms. Women who remember that era do not describe her as an ordinary public figure. She seemed to stand for youth, elegance, history, and national possibility all at once. Lee was inside this world, not outside it. She visited the White House, traveled with Jackie, moved through the same international circles. The sisters' trip to India and Pakistan in 1962 put them in front of enormous crowds and cameras together. Lee's presence could be useful to Jackie and probably a comfort, but the photographs also confirmed a hierarchy. Jackie was the center of the frame. Lee was next to her in it. The position had its rewards. It gave Lee access to extraordinary people and events. It also made it much harder for her to be recognized on her own. A dress that would have made any other woman the most stylish person in the room turned, on Lee, into a comparison with Jackie. A friendship got written up as an extension of the Kennedy circle. Even the royal title sounded like a lesser thing once her sister was First Lady of the United States. Lee later described being with President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis when a telephone call came through with news that could decide whether the standoff turned into all-out war. Her place near the presidency let her watch history from a frightening distance. Public memory tends to keep her in scenes like that one as Jackie's companion rather than as someone who was there. The difference is small, and it is not trivial. One version gives her a point of view. The other uses her to finish somebody else's picture. Then, on November 22, 1963, the picture broke. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lee flew from London to Washington to be with Jackie. Whatever competition had run between them did not cancel what family owes each other in a catastrophe. Lee was there while Jackie faced private shock. 2 small children, a funeral, and the stare of a grieving country. This is where the rivalry story stops being adequate. Lee could feel diminished by Jackie's fame and still move toward her when the worst happened. Jackie could take up more public space and still need her sister. It was never a contest with a winner at the end. It was a bond built out of family comparison, loyalty, hurt, dependence, and a shared understanding of what the public wanted from women who carried famous names. After the assassination, Lee was still facing a question that predated the White House and had only become more pressing. Apart from family, marriage, and social position, what was actually hers? Beauty had brought attention. The title had brought distinction. Neither one gave her the satisfaction of being judged for work she had chosen and finished herself. Lee wanted a profession. That wish is one of the most revealing things about her, partly because it never turned into a clean success story. Her first visible attempt was acting. In 1967, she played Tracy Lord in a stage production of The Philadelphia Story, a part audiences already associated with Katharine Hepburn. She came to it famous and with almost no formal preparation. The reviews were brutal. The next year, she took the lead in a television version of Laura, the mystery audiences remembered from the film with Gene Tierney. Truman Capote, by then one of her closest friends, worked on the adaptation and pushed her to do it. The production drew attention because the title character was being played by a princess who happened to be Jacqueline Kennedy's sister. That guaranteed an audience. It also guaranteed that nobody would judge her the way they would judge an unknown actress learning the job out of sight. The reviews were savage again. Critics found the production dull and Lee unconvincing. Those notices cannot fairly be waved away as proof that the world refused to let her succeed. Privilege had put her into major roles before she had worked her way through small ones. Ambition, visibility, and well-placed friends are not the same thing as training, and the critics were entitled to judge the work in front of them. The failure did expose the trap around her name. Had she succeeded, the coverage would still have led with Jackie. When she failed, the failure became a spectacle because of Jackie. Lee said later that anything she attempted drew attention out of all proportion simply because of who her sister was. Acting did not release her from the comparison. It moved the comparison under brighter lights. Wanting a career was not her mistake. Trying to build one in a field where celebrity opens the door but cannot play the part was. Lee had spent her life being praised for how she looked, dressed, entertained, and moved through a room. Acting asked her to turn presence into technique. The reviews say she had not managed it yet, and she did not stay long enough to get the training she was missing. There was another television experiment in the 1970s. Conversations with Lee Radziwill had her talking with well-known people out of her own social and cultural world. It ran for a handful of episodes. Again, she was trying to convert access and curiosity into work, and again it was brief. These attempts still count for something, because they show persistence rather than idleness. She was not content to stay a photographed guest. She was neither a hidden artistic genius nor a frivolous socialite playing at a job. She had a genuine appetite for creative independence and not always the preparation or the sustained discipline her chosen field demanded. Most people get to find that out privately. Lee found it out in front of critics who saw a famous sister every time they looked at her. By the late 1960s, another relationship had worked its way into the public mythology of the Bouvier sisters. Aristotle Onassis was a Greek shipping magnate with an enormous fortune, a private island, and a reputation built well outside polite American society. He and Lee moved in overlapping international circles. Published accounts and several biographers have described the two of them as romantically involved before he married Jackie. What that relationship actually was cannot be reconstructed with the confidence a dramatic headline implies. There is no reliable basis for saying that Onassis proposed to Lee, that he meant to marry her first, or that Jackie deliberately took him away. Private conversations have come down through biographies, friends, and later interpretation. Some of it may be true. None of it entitles a narrator to stage a confrontation between the sisters. The documented part is that Jackie married Onassis in October of 1968. The marriage shocked a great many Americans. Jackie had been turned into the keeper of President Kennedy's memory, and a portion of the public behaved as though widowhood were a role she owed the country permanently. Marrying a foreign billionaire went against the image that had been built around her. The timing sat inside a run of political violence. President Kennedy had been murdered less than 5 years earlier. His brother, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated in June of 1968. Jackie had 2 children and worried deeply about their safety. Onassis offered money, distance, and physical protection. That helps explain why the marriage could appeal to her. It does not establish one private motive, and it does not erase whatever Lee felt. Biographers have argued that Jackie's marriage to a man previously linked with Lee did serious damage between the sisters. It is a plausible reading, and it should stay attributed rather than get presented as a witnessed confession. Lee publicly rejected the idea that she and Jackie could be reduced to enemies. Her denial does not prove there was no wound. It is a reminder that the relationship belonged to the two of them, and not to an audience that wanted a villain. The triangle was irresistible because it turned a complicated family history into a plot anyone could follow. One beautiful sister had a man. The more famous sister married him. The younger one was left humiliated. That is much easier to keep in your head than the truth, which is that Lee had already been through 2 marriages, motherhood, social ambition, career disappointment, and years of comparison before Onassis entered the story at all. Onassis did not create the competition between Lee and Jackie. He gave it its most dramatic symbol. Once his name was attached, everything else Lee did could be shoved aside. Her acting became proof that she wanted Jackie's attention. Her clothes, proof that she wanted Jackie's status. Her friendship with Capote, proof that she wanted an ally against Jackie. One explanation started swallowing a whole life. There is a more uncomfortable possibility here, too. Lee benefited from the story even while it confined her. The link to Onassis kept her near one of the century's most discussed marriages. The princess title, the Kennedy connection, and the rumored romance all helped keep the public interested. She could resent being known through famous people and go on living in a world where exactly those connections were worth something. That contradiction is not hypocrisy. It was the bargain her life was built on. The same names that opened doors made it impossible to tell which rooms she had entered on her own work. The Onassis story matters, though not because a shipping magnate was a prize one sister won off another. It matters because the public used him to confirm a verdict it had already reached. When Lee and Jackie turned up in the same story, Jackie was going to be the main character. For a while, Truman Capote seemed to offer Lee a different kind of recognition. He was not just a society companion. He was a celebrated writer with a sharp eye for performance, class, loneliness, and ambition. And he had a gift for making people feel seen, particularly people who lived close to power without controlling much of it. He and Lee shared glamorous travel, parties, confidences, and creative projects. He encouraged her acting and adapted Laura for her. Capote also knew how to turn intimacy into leverage. He collected private stories from wealthy women who trusted him, and he understood that in a social world built on discretion, information was worth something. Published accounts say he sometimes praised Lee by belittling Jackie. That may have felt like loyalty. What it actually did was tie Lee's worth to the same comparison she was trying to get out from under. Calling one sister more beautiful by running down the other gave Lee no identity of her own. It just flipped the ranking. In November of 1975, Esquire published Capote's story, La Côte Basque, 1965. The date in the title has confused people, but it is not the publication year. The piece ran in 1975, part of the unfinished project that became Answered Prayers. It exposed, or barely disguised, the private behavior of people in Capote's own circle and wrecked several of his closest friendships. Lee was not the main target. In the fictionalized social conversation, she comes off better than Jackie does. By some accounts, she did not immediately join the other women in cutting him off. The friendship fell apart more decisively later, during Capote's legal fight with the writer Gore Vidal, when Capote attributed a damaging story to Lee, and she denied ever telling it. Capote may well have exploited her trust. He certainly demonstrated what can happen when a writer is given access to private resentment and family history. But the surviving evidence does not support the tidy claim that he destroyed Lee Radziwill. He did not write her acting reviews, invent the lifelong comparison between the sisters, arrange Jackie's marriage to Onassis, or decide what Lee did with the rest of her career. The claim survives because Capote stood for the risk built into Lee's social world, where a friend could turn into an author, and a confidence could turn into material, and a complaint made once in a private room could be repeated forever as a verdict. In that sense, he did not destroy her. He made it obvious how little control she had over a story once it left the room. By the time the friendship broke, Lee was moving toward work that fit what she had actually been good at for years. Her houses had been drawing attention for a long time, and not only because of their addresses. She understood proportion, fabric, color, furniture, and flowers, and she knew the difference between a room that displays money and a room that says something about the person living in it. Interior design let her use the visual intelligence that acting had never managed to translate. In 1976, she set up an interior decorating business in New York. One of its significant jobs was designing suites for Americana hotels. Her clients came largely out of the wealthy world she already knew, and the career was neither vast nor uninterrupted. It was still real work. She was making decisions about spaces that belonged to other people, inside practical constraints, instead of arranging her own surroundings. She had learned from serious designers. Renzo Mongiardino, the celebrated Italian decorator, had worked on homes associated with her and helped shape the layered, cultivated interiors she became known for. Lee absorbed the influence without copying it. Her rooms tended to mix formal furniture with art, books, personal photographs, flowers, and visible signs of use. They looked composed. They did not look like hotel lobbies built to prove a fortune. Design also changed her relationship with judgment. On stage, a critic could decide in one evening whether she belonged. A room gives itself away more slowly. The client has to live in it, use it, have people over, and find out over time whether the beauty came with any comfort. Here, her social experience turned into practical knowledge. She knew how people move through formal spaces where conversation collects, and why an impressive room can still feel inhospitable. She had picked all that up by watching, not at drama school. There was a gendered irony in how the work got received. For most of Lee's life, women of her class were expected to make attractive homes, dress well, and entertain easily while pretending none of it took any real labor. When the result was good, it got called taste. When a woman tried to charge for that judgment, it could be dismissed as a fashionable hobby. Her decorating career sat in that uncertain territory. It was not a major commercial firm. It did turn a quality long treated as ornamental into a service with clients and consequences. Her strongest creative gift was probably not invention in the theatrical sense. It was editing. She could take out whatever made a room or an outfit look like it was straining. She understood that elegance comes down to selection and restraint, and you can see it in how she dressed and in the residences photographed over the years in design and fashion publications. The decorating business never grew into a design empire. Calling Lee one of the century's great decorators would overstate the record. Dismissing the work as a socialite's hobby makes the opposite mistake. She took commissions, developed an aesthetic people could recognize, and got clients to pay for a judgment that society had always treated as merely personal taste. Later, she worked in fashion and public relations connected to Giorgio Armani over different periods as an event planner, style counselor, public relations executive, and brand ambassador. Armani had built a modern language of understated luxury, and Lee wore it as though it had been made for her. Social access was part of the job and not the whole of it. She knew how to put designers, patrons, celebrities, and the press in one room without making the evening look desperate for attention. The work suited something she had been developing since childhood. She knew how public images get built because she had lived inside one. She understood what a room, a guest list, a photograph, and a dress can communicate about status without appearing to ask for approval. The discipline that never quite showed up in her acting was plainly there in how she managed style. Lee was named to the International Best Dressed list many times and entered its Hall of Fame in 1996. The honor belongs to the rarefied world of fashion rather than to a conventional profession. But it confirmed that her visual influence was not borrowed from Jackie. Designers and specialists went on recognizing her taste across decades in which trends changed completely. That kind of longevity is what separates style from one fashionable decade. Lee had first been noticed in an era of structured suits, formal lunches, and carefully arranged society photographs. She stayed relevant through the looser 1970s, the conspicuous glamour of the 1980s, and the pared-down luxury of designers like Armani. She did not obey every demand fashion made. She adjusted proportion, color, and detail while holding on to a recognizable preference for restraint. The result was influence without a clothing label carrying her name. The comparison with her sister never went away. Jackie had entered the same Hall of Fame years earlier, and photographs of Lee still ran beside photographs of Jackie. But the recognition itself was Lee's. She had kept a distinct approach to clothes and interiors long enough that the people in those fields could identify it on sight. Her books were another way of defining herself. One special summer preserved the young Bouvier sisters as collaborators. Later volumes gathered photographs and memories from her own life, family, friends, travel, artists, her children. They were not conventional tell-alls. They settled no disputed relationships and offered no final confession about Jackie. What Lee did instead was choose the record she wanted to leave behind. For someone whose story had so often been assembled by other people, that choosing mattered. Biographers preferred rivalry. Society pages preferred clothes and companions. Capote preferred confidences. Lee's books preferred moments, faces, places, and the private continuity of a life that public accounts had chopped into scandals. Her personal life kept resisting a clean ending. The marriage to Lee Radziwill ended in divorce in the 1970s. In 1988, she married Herbert Ross, the director and choreographer, with a long career in theater and film. It was her third marriage and a union between two people with established lives. She sometimes used the name Lee Radziwill Ross, though the name the public knew stayed Radziwill. That marriage ended in divorce in 2001. 3 marriages could easily be read as proof that Lee never found happiness or that the privileges of her world hit a permanent emptiness. The facts do not support a verdict that total. Her marriages ended for different reasons at very different stages of her life. They brought disappointment, and they also brought family, companionship, experience, and years that cannot be measured only by how they finished. Jackie died in 1994 after an illness. Her will made no further provision for Lee, explaining that she had already done so during her lifetime. She did leave substantial sums to Lee's children. That wording gets presented as a final insult, but a legal document cannot on its own explain the emotional history of two sisters. It confirms that Jackie believed she had already helped Lee. It does not prove hatred, revenge, or a last attempt to erase her. Jackie's death ended the relationship without ending the public fascination with it. After decades of asking whether the sisters had competed, people started reading the will as a closing scorecard. The simpler fact was that the woman Lee had been measured against since childhood was gone. Nothing between them could be revised now. No reconciliation, no grievance, no shared memory. 5 years later, Lee suffered a loss that had nothing to do with social rivalry. Her son Anthony had been living with cancer. In the summer of 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., Jackie's son and Anthony's cousin, died in a plane crash along with his wife and sister-in-law. Less than a month after that, Anthony died of his illness at the age of 40. The two deaths so close together tied the families back together in public mourning, but Anthony's death was Lee's own loss as a mother, and it should not be treated as one more dramatic chapter in the Kennedy story. Anthony had built a career in television news and married Carol DeFalco, later known as Carol Radziwill. His long illness had demanded privacy, endurance, and care. For Lee, this was not a symbol. It was the loss of her child. In her later years, Lee still turned up at fashion events, kept homes in New York and Paris, and stayed connected to designers, artists, and younger cultural figures. She outlived most of the people who had defined the most photographed decades of her life. Capote died in 1984. Jackie died a decade after that. Herbert Ross died in 2001. Little by little, Lee stopped being the glamorous younger sister and became one of the last living witnesses to a social world that no longer existed. Age gave her what fame never had: distance. She could look back at the acting failures without pretending they had been successes. She could recognize how unusual her opportunities had been. She could also insist that public scrutiny had distorted the scale of everything she tried. A small professional experiment turned into news because of Jackie. A friendship turned into evidence in a family feud. A reported romance turned into the explanation for decades of feeling. She did not retreat into privacy. She kept being photographed and interviewed, and she stayed conscious of style until the end of her life. She simply became more selective about what she handed over. Her later reflections are not the reflections of a woman claiming every disappointment had been done to her. She admitted regret and also said she was content with the remarkable experiences she had been given. When Lee died in New York in February of 2019, she was 85. The first line of nearly every obituary had Jackie's name in it. That was understandable. The relationship was historically significant, and Jackie's fame let readers place Lee immediately. It also completed the pattern Lee had spent her adult life trying to complicate. The obituaries then listed the evidence that she had not been an appendage: 3 marriages, 2 children, acting, television, interior design, fashion work, books, friendships with major artists, a lasting reputation for style. The independent life was in the record. It just came after the familiar introduction. So did Lee Radziwill fail to build an identity of her own? No. She built several versions of one, and some worked better than others. The princess had status and no permanent security. The actress got opportunities she had not yet developed the skill to justify. The television host lasted a few episodes. The decorator and the fashion professional found work much closer to what she was actually good at. And the mother, sister, friend, and keeper of memories occupied parts of her life that no professional title covers. Her privilege has to stay in the verdict. The family name, the marriages, the money, and the connection to Jackie opened doors. She was not an unknown woman shut out by a cruel world. She could try, fail, travel, start again, and remain visible because she had advantages most women never get. Acknowledging that is not the same as handing every achievement to Jackie. Lee's eye for design was hers. So was the decision to start a decorating business in middle age. The work with Armani took her own judgment and her own relationships. Her taste lasted because it was recognizable, not because anyone had confused her clothes with her sisters. The rivalry story survived because it had a satisfying shape. Two beautiful sisters, unequal fame, a powerful man, a brilliant gossip, and enough silence in the middle to fill with guesswork. Lee's actual life was messier than that. It held affection next to resentment, ambition next to inadequate preparation, privilege next to grief, and real work next to celebrity. Jackie's fame did not stop Lee from having a life. It set the scale that life got measured on. Onassis did not define the sisters' relationship, though his marriage to Jackie gave the old comparison an image nobody could forget. Capote did not destroy Lee, though his use of private knowledge showed how quickly intimacy becomes public property. Lee Radziwill did build a life of her own. The problem was never that the life did not exist. It was that public memory kept putting Jackie's name in front of it. Lee understood the verdict, and in the end, she answered it more directly than any biographer could. I'm nobody's kid sister. If Lee Radziwill's story changed the way you see the Bouvier sisters, subscribe to Gilded Women and join us as we look beyond the public image to the women history never fully explained. Do you think Lee Radziwill truly lived in Jackie's shadow, or has history simply failed to remember what she built for herself?